The definition of significant harm was amended in the Children's Act in 2002 to encompass the experiences of a child who is living in a domestic abuse environment. So it now recognises the impact of seeing and hearing ill treatment towards others. So when we think about domestic abuse, we recognise it as coercive, controlling, threatening behaviours and violent behaviours of anybody over the age of 16 years of age. And it can be with people they're in a relationship with, it can be with ex-partners, but more importantly, it doesn't actually have to be intimate partners, and it can be within family members. When we think of domestic abuse, we recognise that it consists of psychological, social, physical, emotional abuse, sexual abuse and financial abuse. So it's really important that domestic abuse is kept at the forefront of child safeguarding and child protection.
And they could start to think that having that volatile relationship, those negative, experiences is a part of a normal relationship and a part of normal coping to stressful situations. And unless they have proper support to kind of learn that, violence in any form in any relationship is not okay, they might continue to believe that and then show that in other relationships, which then can then put other people at risk.
Professionals sometimes don't always see domestic abuse as a safeguarding child protection issues, and there can be several reasons for this. One of them is that very often all attention and focus is on the adult, the victim and survivor. So often victim survivors are struggling because of the domestic abuse with their own mental health. They may be have feelings of suicidal, they may have depression, or alternatively, they may turn to alcohol and drugs as a really unhealthy coping mechanism to manage their experience of domestic abuse. And while it's really important that we address those issues with the victim survivor, we also can't lose sight of the fact that there's a child in that home and a child growing up with a parent and a perpetrator who are suffering from the effects of that behaviour. And we need to consider the impact that has on that parent and the perpetrator's ability to provide a safe space for that child to grow up in.
Children are sometimes the forgotten victims, and agencies don't necessarily mean to forget them. It's just that if they're told, well, they didn't witness it, they weren't in the room or they were at school, so it doesn't really affect them. That's how sometimes they can just be overseen or overlooked.
And very often what we need to do as professionals is, as well as manage what's happening for the adults, we also need to consider what it's like for a child to live in that home and experience those emotions on a day-to-day basis. Another area that I think sometimes gets overlooked and when services pull out is when a victim survivor decides to end a relationship. So very often professionals can see that that's the end of the domestic abuse, that the victim survivor has decided to end the relationship. But we know that that's not the case. We know that coercive controlling behaviours lasts far beyond that current relationship, and post-separation is recognised within domestic abuse legislation. We often find that parents who are separated will use ways to coercively control children through contact. So it's really important to recognise that just because a domestic abuse relationship is ended does not mean that the domestic abuse has ended.